Beyond the Singing Flame. When I, Philip Hastane, gave to the world the journal of my friend Giles Angarth, I was still doubtful as to whether the incidents related therein were fiction or verity. The trans-dimensional adventures of Angarth and Ebonley, the city of flame with its strange residents and pilgrims, the immolation of Ebonley, and the hinted return of the narrator himself for a like purpose, after making the last entry in his diary, were very much the sort of thing that Angarth might have imagined in one of the fantastic novels for which he had become so justly famous. Add to this the seemingly impossible and incredible nature of the whole tale, and my hesitancy in accepting it as veridical will easily be understood. However, on the other hand, there was the unsolved and eternally recalcitrant enigma offered by the disappearance of the two men. Both were well known, the one as a writer, the other as an artist. Both were in flourishing circumstances, with no serious cares or troubles, and their vanishment, all things considered, was difficult to explain on the grounds of any motive less unusual or extraordinary than the ones assigned in the journal. At first, as I have hinted in my foreword to the published diary, I thought that the whole affair might well have been devised as a somewhat elaborate practical joke. But this theory became less and less tenable as weeks and months went by, and linked themselves slowly into a year, without the reappearance of the presumptive jokers. Now, at last, I can testify to the truth of all that Angarth wrote, and more. For I, too, have been in Idmos, the city of singing flame, and have known also the supernal glories and raptures of the inner dimension, and of these I must tell, however falteringly and stumblingly, with mere human words, ere the vision fades. For these are things which neither I nor any other shall behold or experience again, since Idmos itself is now a riven ruin, and the temple of the flame has been blasted to its foundations in the basic rock, and the fountain of singing fire has been stricken at its source, and the inner dimension has perished like a broken bubble in the great war that was made upon Idmos by the rulers of the outer lands. After editing and publishing Angarth's journal, I was unable to forget the peculiar and tantalizing problems it had raised. The vague but infinitely suggestive vistas opened by the tale were such as to haunt my imagination recurrently with a hint of half-revealed or hidden mysteries. And I was troubled by the possibility of some great mystic meaning behind it all, some cosmic actuality of which the narrator had perceived merely the external veils and fringes. As time went on, I found myself pondering it perpetually, and more I was possessed by an overwhelming wonder and a sense of something which no mere fiction weaver would have been likely to invent through the unassisted workings of his own fantasy. In the early summer of 1931, after finishing a new novel of interplanetary adventure, I felt able for the first time to take the necessary leisure for the execution of a project that had often occurred to me. Putting all my affairs in order, and knitting all the loose ends of my literary labors and correspondence, in case I should not return, I left Auburn ostensibly for a week's vacation, and actually went to the summit with the idea of investigating closely the milieu in which Angarth and Ebonley had disappeared from human ken. With strange emotions I visited the forsaken cabin south of Crater Ridge that had been occupied by Angarth, and saw the rough, homemade table of pine boards upon which my friend had written his journal, and had left the sealed package containing it to be forwarded to me after his departure. There was a weird and brooding loneliness about the place, as if the non-human infinitudes had already claimed it for their own. The unlocked door had sagged inward from the pressure of high-piled winter snows, and fir needles had sifted across the sill to strew the unswept floor. Somehow, I know not why, the bizarre narrative became more real and more credible to me while I stood there, as if an occult intimation of all that had happened to its author still lingered around the cabin. This mysterious intimation grew stronger when I came to visit Crater Ridge itself. and to search amid its miles of pseudo-volcanic rubble for the two boulders so explicitly described by Angarth as having a likeness to the pedestals of ruined columns. Many of my readers, no doubt, will remember his description of the ridge, and there is no need to enlarge upon it with reiterative detail other than that which bears upon my own adventures. Following the northward path which Angarth must have taken from his cabin, and trying to retrace his wanderings on the long, barren hill, I combed it thoroughly from end to end and from side to side, since he had not specified the location of the boulders. After 2 mornings spent in this manner without result, I was almost ready to abandon the quest and dismiss the queer, soapy, greenish-gray column ends as one of Angarth's most provocative and deceptive fictions. It must have been the formless, haunting intuition of which I have spoken that made me renew the search on the 3rd morning. This time, after crossing and recrossing the hilltop for an hour or more, and weaving tortuously to and fro among the cicada-haunted wild currant bushes and sunflowers on the dusty slopes, I came at last to an open, circular, rock-surrounded space that was totally unfamiliar, and which I had somehow missed in all my previous roamings. It was the place of which Angarth had told, and I saw, with an inexpressible thrill, the 2 rounded, worn-looking boulders that were situated in the center of the ring. I believe that I trembled a little with excitement as I went forward to inspect the curious stones. Bending over, but not daring to enter the bare, pebbly space between them, I touched one of them with my hand, and received a sensation of preternatural smoothness, together with a coolness that was inexplicable, considering that the boulders and the soil about them must have lain unshaded from the sultry August sun for many hours. From that moment, I became fully persuaded that Angarth's account was no mere fable. Just why I should have felt so certain of this I am powerless to say, but it seemed to me that I stood on the threshold of an ultra-mundane mystery, on the brink of uncharted gulfs, and I looked about at the familiar Sierran valleys and mountains, wondering that they still preserved in their wonted outlines, and were still unchanged by the contiguity of alien worlds, were still untouched by the luminous glories of arcanic dimensions. Being convinced that I had indeed found the gateway between the worlds, I was prompted to strange reflections. What and where was this other sphere to which my friend had attained entrance? Was it near at hand, like a secret room in the structure of space? Or was it in reality millions or trillions of light-years away by the reckoning of astronomic distance in a planet of some ulterior galaxy? After all, we know little or nothing of the actual nature of space, and perhaps in some way that we cannot imagine, the infinite is doubled upon itself in places, with dimensional folds and tucks, and shortcuts whereby the distance to Algenib or Aldebaran is but a step. Perhaps also there is more than one infinity. The spatial flaw into which Angarth had fallen might well be a sort of superdimension, abridging the cosmic intervals and connecting universe with universe. However, because of this very certitude that I had found the interspheric portals, and could follow Angarth and Ebonley if I so desired, I hesitated before trying the experiment, mindful of the mystic danger and irrefragable lure that had overcome the others. I was consumed by imaginative curiosity, by an avid, well-nigh feverish longing to behold the wonders of this exotic realm, but I did not propose to become a victim to the opiate power and fascination of the singing flame. I stood for a long time, eyeing the odd boulders and the barren, pebble-littered spot that gave admission to the unknown. At length, I went away, deciding to defer my venture till the following morn. Visualizing the weird doom to which the others had gone so voluntarily and even gladly, I must confess that I was afraid. On the other hand, I was drawn by the fateful allurement that leads an explorer into far places, and perhaps by something more than this. I slept badly that night, with nerves and brain excited by formless, glowing premonitions, by intimations of half-conceived perils and splendors and vastnesses. Early the next morning, while the sun was still hanging above the Nevada mountains, I returned to Crater Ridge. I carried a strong hunting knife and a Colt revolver, and wore a filled cartridge belt, and also a knapsack containing sandwiches and a thermos bottle of coffee. Before starting, I had stuffed my ears tightly with cotton soaked in a new anesthetic fluid, mild but efficacious, which would serve to deafen me completely for many hours. In this way, I felt that I should be immune to the demoralizing music of the fiery fountain. I peered about, on the rugged landscape with its varied and far-flung vistas, wondering if I should ever see it again. Then, resolutely, but with the eerie thrilling and shrinking of one who throws himself from a high cliff into some bottomless chasm, I stepped forward into the space between the grayish-green boulders. My sensations, generally speaking, were similar to those described by Angarth in his diary. Blackness and illimitable emptiness seemed to wrap me round in a dizzy swirl as of rushing wind or milling water, and I went down and down in a spiral descent whose duration I have never been able to estimate. Intolerably stifled, and without even the power to gasp for breath in the chill, airless vacuum that froze my very muscles and marrow, I felt that I should lose consciousness in another moment and descend into the greater gulf of death or oblivion. Something seemed to arrest my fall, and I became aware that I was standing still, though I was troubled for some time by a queer doubt as to whether my position was vertical, horizontal, or upside down in relation to the solid substance that my feet had encountered. Then the blackness lifted slowly like a dissolving cloud, and I saw the slope of violet grass, the rows of irregular monoliths running downward from where I stood, and the gray-green columns near at hand, and the Titan perpendicular city of red stone that was dominant above the high and multicolored vegetation of the plain. It was all very much as Angarth had depicted it, but somehow, even then, I became aware of differences that were not immediately or clearly definable, of scenic details and atmospheric elements for which his account had not prepared me, and at the moment I was too thoroughly disequilibrated and overpowered by the vision of it all to even speculate concerning the character of these differences. As I gazed at the city with its crowding tiers of battlements and its multitude of overlooming spires, I felt the invisible threads of a secret attraction, was seized by an imperative longing to know the mysteries hidden behind the massive walls and the myriad buildings. Then, a moment later, my gaze was drawn to the remote opposite horizon of the plain, as if by some conflicting impulse whose nature and origin were undiscoverable. It must have been because I had formed so clear and definite a picture of the scene from my friend's narrative that I was surprised and even a little disturbed as if by something wrong or irrelevant, when I saw in the far distance the shining towers of what seemed to be another city, a city of which Angarth had not written. The towers rose in serried lines, reaching for many miles in a curious arc-like formation, and were sharply defined against a blackish mass of cloud that had reared behind them and was spreading out on the luminous, amber sky in sullen webs and sinister, crawling filaments. Subtle disquietude and repulsion seemed to emanate from the far-off glittering spires, even as attraction emanated from those of the nearer city. I saw them quiver and pulse with an evil light, like living and moving things through what I assumed to be some refractive trick of the atmosphere. Then, for an instant, the black cloud behind them glowed with dull, angry crimson throughout its whole mass, and even its questing webs and tendrils were turned into lurid threads of fire. The crimson faded, leaving the cloud inert and lumpish as before, but from many of the vanward towers lines of red and violet flame had leaped, like outthrust lances at the bosom of the plain beneath them, and they were held thus for at least a minute, moving slowly across a wide area before they vanished. In the spaces between the towers, I now perceived a multitude of gleaming, restless particles, like armies of militant atoms, and wondered if perchance they were living things. If the idea had not appeared so fantastical, I could have sworn even then that the far city had already changed its position and was advancing toward the other on the plain. Apart from the fulguration of the cloud, and the flames that had sprung from the towers, and the quiverings which I deemed a refractive phenomenon, the whole landscape before and about me was unnaturally still. On the strange amber air, on the Tyrian-tinted grasses, on the proud, opulent foliage of the unknown trees, there lay the dead calm that precedes the stupendous turmoil of typhonic storm or seismic cataclysm. The brooding sky was permeated with intuitions of cosmic menace, was weighed down by a dim elemental despair. Alarmed by this ominous atmosphere, I looked behind me at the two pillars which, according to Angarth, were the gateway of return to the human world. For an instant I was tempted to go back. Then I turned once more to the nearby city, and the feelings I have mentioned were lost in an over-surging awesomeness and wonder. I felt the thrill of a deep, supernal exaltation before the magnitude of the mighty buildings. A compelling sorcery was laid upon me by the very lines of their construction, by the harmonies of a solemn, architectural music. I forgot my impulse to return to Crater Ridge, and started down the slope toward the city. Soon the boughs of the purple and yellow forest arched above me like the altitudes of Titan-builded isles, with leaves that fretted the rich heaven in gorgeous arabesques. Beyond them, ever and anon, I caught glimpses of the piled ramparts of my destination. But looking back in the direction of that other city on the horizon, I found that its fulgurating towers were now lost to view. I saw, however, that the masses of the great, somber cloud were rising steadily on the sky, and once again they flared to a swart, malignant red, as if with some unearthly form of sheet lightning, and though I could hear nothing with my deadened ears, the ground beneath me trembled with long vibrations as of thunder. There was a queer quality in the vibrations that seemed to tear my nerves and set my teeth on edge with its throbbing, lancinating discord, painful as broken glass or the torment of a tightened rack. Like Angarth before me, I came to the paved Cyclopean highway. Following it, in the stillness after the unheard peals of thunder, I felt another and subtler vibration, which I knew to be that of the singing flame in the temple at the city's core. It seemed to soothe and exalt and bear on me, to erase with soft caresses the ache that still lingered in my nerves from the torturing pulsations of the thunder. I met no one on the road, and was not passed by any of the transdimensional pilgrims such as had overtaken Angarth. And when the accumulated ramparts loomed above the highest trees, and I came forth from the wood in their very shadow, I saw that the great gate of the city was closed, leaving no crevice through which a pygmy like myself might obtain entrance. Feeling a profound and peculiar discomfiture, such as one would experience in a dream that had gone wrong, I stared at the grim, unrelenting blankness of the gate, which seemed to be wrought from one enormous sheet of somber and lusterless metal. Then I peered upward at the sheerness of the wall, which rose above me like an alpine cliff, and saw that the battlements were seemingly deserted. Was the city forsaken by its people? By the guardians of the flame? Was it no longer open to the pilgrims who came from outlying lands to worship the flame and to immolate themselves? With a curious reluctance, after lingering there for many minutes in a sort of stupor, I turned away to retrace my steps. In the interim of my journey, the black cloud had drawn immeasurably nearer, and was now blotting half the heaven with two portentous wing-like formations. It was a sinister and terrible sight, and it lightened again with that ominous, wrathful flaming, with a detonation that beat upon my deaf ears like waves of disintegrative force, and seemed to lacerate the inmost fibers of my body. I hesitated, fearing that the storm would burst upon me before I could reach the interdimensional portals. I saw that I should be exposed to an elemental disturbance of unfamiliar character and supreme violence. Then, in midair, before the imminent, ever-rising cloud, I perceived two flying creatures whom I can compare only to gigantic moths. With bright, luminous wings upon the ebon forefront of the storm, They approached me in level but precipitate flight, and would have crashed headlong against the shut gate if they had not checked themselves with sudden and easy poise. With hardly a flutter they descended and paused on the ground beside me, supporting themselves on queer, delicate legs that branched at the knee joints in floating antennae and waving tentacles. Their wings were sumptuously mottled webs of pearl and madder and opal and orange, and their heads were circled by a series of convex and concave eyes, and were fringed with coiling, horn-like organs from whose hollow ends there hung aerial filaments. I was more than startled, more than amazed by their aspect, but somehow, by an obscure telepathy, I felt assured that their intentions toward me were friendly. I knew that they wished to enter the city, and knew also that they understood my predicament. Nevertheless, I was not prepared for what happened. With movements of utmost celerity and grace, one of the giant moth-like beings stationed himself at my right hand, and the other at my left. Then, before I could even suspect their intention, they enfolded my limbs and body with their long tentacles, wrapping me round and round as if with powerful ropes, and carrying me between them as if my weight were a mere trifle. They arose in air and soared at the mighty ramparts. In that swift and effortless ascent, the wall seemed to flow downward beside and beneath us like a wave of molten stone. Dizzily I watched the falling away of the mammoth blocks into endless recession. Then we were level with the broad ramparts, were flying across the unguarded parapets, and over a canyon-like space toward the immense, rectangular buildings and numberless square towers. We had hardly crossed the walls when a weird and flickering glow was cast on the edifices before us by another lightning of the great cloud. The moth-like beings paid no apparent heed, and flew steadily on into the city with their strange faces toward an unseen goal. But turning my head to peer backward at the storm, I beheld an astounding and appalling spectacle. Beyond the city ramparts, as if wrought by black magic or the toil of genii, another city had reared, and its high towers were moving swiftly forward beneath the rubescent dome of the burning cloud. A second glance, and I perceived that the towers were identical with those I had beheld afar on the plain. In the interim of my passage through the woods, they had traveled over an expanse of many miles by means of some unknown motive power, and had closed in on the city of the flame. Looking more closely to determine the manner of their locomotion, I saw that they were not mounted on wheels, but on short, massy legs like jointed columns of metal that gave them the stride of ungainly colossi. There were 6 or more of these legs to each tower, and near the tops of the towers were rows of huge eye-like openings, from which issued the bolts of red and violet flame I have mentioned before. The many-colored forest had been burned away by these flames in a league-wide swath of devastation, even to the walls, and there was nothing but a stretch of black, vaporing desert between the mobile towers and the city. Then, even as I gazed, the long, leaping beams began to assail the craggy ramparts, and the topmost parapets were melting like lava beneath them. It was a scene of utmost terror and grandeur, but a moment later, it was blotted from my vision by the buildings among which we had now plunged. The great lepidopterous creatures who bore me went on with the speed of eerie questing eagles. In the course of that amazing flight, I was hardly capable of conscious thought or volition. I lived only in the breathless and giddy freedom of aerial movement, of dreamlike levitation above the labyrinthine maze of stone immensitudes and marvels. Also, I was without conscious cognizance of much that I beheld in that stupendous babel of architectural imageries, and only afterward, in the more tranquil light of recollection, could I give coherent form and meaning to many of my impressions. My senses were stunned by the vastness and strangeness of it all, and I realized but dimly the cataclysmic ruin that was being loosed upon the city behind us, and the doom from which we were fleeing. I knew that war was being made with unearthly weapons and engineries by inimical powers that I could not imagine, for a purpose beyond my conception. But to me, it all had the elemental confusion and vague, impersonal horror of some cosmic catastrophe. We flew deeper and deeper into the city. Broad platform roofs and terrace-like tiers of balconies flowed away beneath us, and the pavements raced like darkling streams at some enormous depth. Severe cubicular spires and square monoliths were all about and above us, and we saw on some of the roofs the dark, Atlantean people of the city, moving slowly and statuesquely, or standing in attitudes of cryptic resignation and despair, with their faces toward the flaming cloud. All were weaponless, and I saw no engineries anywhere such as might be used for purposes of military defense. Swiftly as we flew, the climbing cloud was swifter, and the darkness of its intermittently glowing dome had overarched the town. Its spidery filaments had meshed the further heavens, and would soon attach themselves to the opposite horizon. The buildings darkened and lightened with the recurrent fulguration, and I felt in all my tissues the painful pulsing of the thunderous vibrations. Dully and vaguely, I realized that the winged beings who carried me between them were pilgrims to the Temple of the Flame. More and more I became aware of an influence that must have been that of the starry music emanating from the temple's heart. There were soft, soothing vibrations in the air that seemed to absorb and nullify the tearing discords of the unheard thunder. I felt that we were entering a zone of mystic refuge, of sidereal and celestial security, and my troubled senses were both lulled and exalted. The gorgeous wings of the giant lepidopters began to slant downward. Before and beneath us, at some distance, I perceived a mammoth pile, which I knew at once for the Temple of the Flame. Down, still down we went, in the awesome space of the surrounding square, and then I was borne in through the lofty, ever-open entrance, and along the high hall with its 1,000 columns. It was like some corridor in a Karnak of Titan worlds. Pregnant with strange balsams, the dim, mysterious dusk enfolded us, and we seemed to be entering realms of premundane antiquity and transstellar immensity, to be following a pillared cavern that led to the core of some ultimate star. It seemed that we were the last and only pilgrims, and also that the temple was deserted by its guardians, for we met no one in the whole extent of that column-crowded gloom. After a while, the dusk began to lighten, and we plunged into a widening beam of radiance, and then into the vast central chamber in which soared the fountain of green fire. I remember only the impression of shadowy, flickering space, of a vault that was lost in the azure of infinity, of colossal and Memnonian statues that looked down from Himalaya-like altitudes, and above all, the dazzling jet of flame that aspired from a pit in the pavement and rose in the air like the visible rapture of gods. But all this I saw and knew for an instant only. Then I realized that the beings who bore me were flying straight toward the flame on level wings, without the slightest pause or flutter of hesitation. There was no room for fear, no time for alarm in the dazed and chaotic turmoil of my sensations. I was stupefied by all that I had experienced, and moreover, the drug-like spell of the flame was upon me, even though I could not hear its fatal singing. I believe that I struggled a little, by some sort of mechanical muscular revulsion, against the tentacular arms that were wound about me, but the lepidopters gave no heed, and it was plain that they were conscious of nothing but the mounting fire and its seductive music. I remember, however, that there was no sensation of actual heat, such as might have been expected when we neared the soaring column. Instead, I felt the most ineffable thrilling in all my fibers, as if I were being permeated by waves of celestial energy and demiurgic ecstasy. Then we entered the flame. Like Angarth before me, I had taken it for granted that the fate of all those who flung themselves into the flame was an instant, though blissful, destruction. I expected to undergo a briefly flaring dissolution, followed by the nothingness of utter annihilation. The thing which really happened was beyond the boldest reach of speculative thought, and to give even the meagerest idea of my sensations would beggar the resources of language. The flame enfolded us like a green curtain, blotting from view the great chamber. Then it seemed to me that I was caught and carried to super-celestial heights, in an upward rushing cataract of quintessential force and deific rapture and all-illuminating light. It seemed that I, and also my companions, had achieved a godlike union with the flame, that every atom of our bodies had undergone a transcendental expansion, was winged with ethereal lightness, that we no longer existed except as one divine, indivisible entity, soaring beyond the trammels of matter, beyond the limits of time and space, to attain undreamable shores. Unspeakable was the joy, and infinite was the freedom of that ascent, in which we seemed to overpass the zenith of the highest star. Then, as if we had risen with the flame to its culmination, had reached its very apex, we emerged and came to a pause. My senses were faint with exaltation, my eyes were blind with the glory of the fire, and the world on which I now gazed was a vast arabesque of unfamiliar forms and bewildering hues from another spectrum than the one to which our eyes are habituated. It swirled before my dizzy eyes like a labyrinth of gigantic jewels, with interweaving rays and tangled lustres, and only by slow degrees was I able to establish order and distinguish detail in the surging riot of my perceptions. All about me were endless avenues of super-prismatic opal and jacinth, arches and pillars of ultraviolet gems, of transcendent sapphire, of unearthly ruby and amethyst, all suffused with a multi-tinted splendor. I appeared to be treading on jewels, and above me was a jeweled sky. Presently, with recovered equilibrium, with eyes adjusted to a new range of cognition, I began to perceive the actual features of the landscape. I, with the two moth-like beings still beside me, was standing on a million-flowered grass, among trees of a paradisal vegetation, with fruit, foliage, blossoms, and trunks, whose very forms were beyond the conception of tridimensional life. The grace of their drooping boughs, of their fretted fronds, was inexpressible in terms of earthly line and contour, and they seemed to be wrought of pure, ethereal substance, half translucent to the Empyrean light, which accounted for the gem-like impression I had first received. I breathed a nectar-laden air, and the ground beneath me was ineffably soft and resilient, as if it were composed of some higher form of matter than ours. My physical sensations were those of the utmost buoyancy and well-being, with no trace of fatigue or nervousness, such as might have been looked for after the unparalleled and marvelous events in which I had played a part. I felt no sense of mental dislocation or confusion, and apart from my ability to recognize unknown colors and non-Euclidean forms, I began to experience a queer alteration and extension of tactility, through which it seemed that I was able to touch remote objects. The radiant sky was filled with many-colored suns, like those that might shine on a world of some multiple solar system. But strangely, as I gazed, their glory became softer and dimmer, and the brilliant luster of the trees and grass was gradually subdued, as if by encroaching twilight. I was beyond surprise in the boundless marvel and mystery of it all, and nothing perhaps would have seemed incredible. But if anything could have amazed me or defied belief, it was the human face, the face of my vanished friend, Giles Angarth, which now emerged from among the waning jewels of the forest, followed by that of another man whom I recognized from photographs I had seen as Felix Ebenly. They came out from beneath the gorgeous boughs and paused before me. Both were clad in lustrous fabrics, finer than oriental silk, and of no earthly cut or pattern. Their look was both joyous and meditative, and their faces had taken on a hint of the same translucency that characterized the ethereal fruits and blossoms. "We have been looking for you," said Angarth. "It occurred to me that after reading my journal, you might be tempted to try the same experiments, if only to make sure whether the account was truth or fiction. This is Felix Ebenly, whom I believe you have never met." It surprised me when I found that I could hear his voice with perfect ease and clearness, and I wondered why the effect of the drug-soaked cotton should have died out so soon in my auditory nerves. Yet such details were trivial in face of the astounding fact that I had found Angarth and Ebenly, that they, as well as I, had survived the unearthly rapture of the flame. "Where are we?" I asked, after acknowledging his introduction. "I confess that I am totally at a loss to comprehend what has happened." "We are now in what is called the inner dimension," explained Angarth. "It is a higher sphere of space and energy and matter than the one into which we were precipitated from Crater Ridge, and the only entrance is through the singing flame in the city of Idmos. The inner dimension is born of the fiery fountain and sustained by it, and those who fling themselves into the flame are lifted thereby to this superior plane of vibration. For them, the outer worlds no longer exist. The nature of the flame itself is not known, except that it is a fountain of pure energy, springing from the central rock beneath Idmos, and passing beyond mortal ken by virtue of its own ardency." He paused, and seemed to be peering attentively at the winged entities who still lingered at my side. Then he continued, "I haven't been here long enough to learn very much myself, but I have found out a few things, and Ebenly and I have established a sort of telepathic communication with the other beings who have passed through the flame. Many of them have no spoken language, nor organs of speech, and their very methods of thought are basically different from ours because of their divergent lines of sense development and the varying conditions of the worlds from which they come. But we are able to communicate a few images. The persons who came with you are trying to tell me something," he went on. "You and they, it seems, are the last pilgrims who will enter Idmos and attain the inner dimension. War is being made on the flame and its guardians by the rulers of the outer lands, because so many of their people have obeyed the lure of the singing fountain and have vanished into the higher sphere. And even now their armies have closed in upon Idmos and are blasting the city's ramparts with the force bolts of their moving towers." I told him what I had seen, comprehending now much that had been obscure heretofore. He listened gravely, and then said, "It has long been feared that such war would be made sooner or later. There are many legends in the outer lands concerning the flame and the fate of those who succumb to its attraction. But the truth is not known or is guessed only by a few. Many believe, as I did, that the end is destruction, and even by some who suspect its existence, the inner dimension is hated as a thing that lures idle dreamers away from worldly reality. It is regarded as a lethal and pernicious chimera, or a mere poetic dream, or a sort of opium paradise. There are 1,000 things to tell you regarding the inner sphere and the laws and conditions of being to which we are now subject after the revibration of all our component atoms and electrons in the flame. But at present there is no time to speak further, since it is highly probable that we are all in grave danger, that the very existence of the inner dimension, as well as our own, is threatened by the inimical forces that are destroying Idmos. There are some who say that the flame is impregnable, that its pure essence will defy the blasting of all inferior beams, and its source remain impenetrable to the dire lightnings of the outer lords. But most are fearful of disaster, and expect the failure of the fountain itself when Idmos is riven to the central rock. Because of this imminent peril, we must not tarry longer. There is a way which affords egress from the inner sphere to another and remoter cosmos in a second infinity, a cosmos unconceived by mundane astronomers, or by the astronomers of the worlds about Idmos. The majority of the pilgrims after a term of sojourn here have gone on to the worlds of this other universe, and Ebenly and I have waited only for your coming before following them. We must make haste, and delay no more, or doom will overtake us." Even as he spoke, the two moth-like entities, seeming to resign me to the care of my human friends, arose on the jewel-tinted air and sailed in a long level flight above the paradisal perspectives whose remoter avenues were lost in glory. Angarth and Devonley had now stationed themselves beside me, and one took me by the left arm, and the other by the right. "Try to imagine that you are flying," said Angarth. "In this sphere, levitation and flight are possible through willpower, and you will soon acquire the ability. We shall support and guide you, however, till you have grown accustomed to the new conditions and are independent of such help." I obeyed his injunction and formed a mental image of myself in the act of flying. I was amazed by the clearness and verisimilitude of the thought picture, and still more by the fact that the picture was becoming an actuality. With little sense of effort, but with exactly the same feeling that characterizes a levitational dream, the three of us were soaring from the jeweled ground, were slanting easily and swiftly upward through the glowing air. Any attempt to describe the experience would be foredoomed to futility, since it seemed that a whole range of new senses had been opened up in me, together with corresponding thought symbols for which there are no words in human speech. I was no longer Philip Hastane, but a larger and stronger and freer entity, differing as much from my former self as the personality developed beneath the influence of hashish or kava would differ. The dominant feeling was one of immense joy and liberation, coupled with a sense of imperative haste, of the need to escape into other realms where the joy would endure eternal and unthreatened. My visual perceptions, as we flew above the burning, lucent woods, were marked by intense aesthetic pleasure, as far above the normal delight afforded by agreeable imagery as the forms and colors of this world were beyond the cognition of normal eyes. Every changing image was a source of veritable ecstasy, and the ecstasy mounted as the whole landscape began to brighten again, and returned to the flashing, scintillating glory it had worn when I first beheld it. We soared at a lofty elevation, looking down on numberless miles of labyrinthine forest, on long, luxurious meadows, on voluptuously folded hills, on palatial buildings, and waters that were clear as the pristine lakes and rivers of Eden. It all seemed to quiver and pulsate like one living, effulgent, ethereal entity, and waves of radiant rapture passed from sun to sun in the splendor-crowded heaven. As we went on, I noticed again, after an interval, that partial dimming of the light, that somnolent, dreamy saddening of the colors, to be followed by another period of ecstatic brightening. The slow, tidal rhythm of this process appeared to correspond to the rising and falling of the flame, as Angarth had described it in his journal, and I suspected immediately that there was some connection. No sooner had I formulated this thought, when I became aware that Angarth was speaking, and yet I am not sure whether he spoke or whether his worded thought was perceptible to me through another sense than that of physical audition. At any rate, I was cognizant of his comment. "You are right. The waning and waxing of the fountain and its music is perceived in the inner dimension as a clouding and lightening of all visual images." Our flight began to swiffen, and I realized that my companions were employing all their psychic energies in an effort to redouble our speed. The lands below us blurred to a cataract of streaming color, a sea of flowing luminosity, and we seemed to be hurtling onward like stars through the fiery air. The ecstasy of that endless soaring, the anxiety of that precipitate flight from an unknown doom are incommunicable, but I shall never forget them, and never forget the state of ineffable communion and understanding that existed between the three of us. The memory of it all is housed in the deepest and most abiding cells of my brain. Others were flying beside and above and beneath us now in the fluctuant glory, pilgrims of hidden worlds and occult dimensions, proceeding as we ourselves toward that other cosmos of which the inner sphere was the antechamber. These beings were strange and outre beyond belief in their corporeal forms and attributes. And yet I took no thought of their strangeness, but felt toward them the same conviction of fraternity that I felt toward Angarth and Ebonley. Now, as we still went on, it appeared to me that my two companions were telling me many things, were communicating, by what means I'm not sure, much that they had learned in their new existence, with a grave urgency, as if perhaps the time for imparting this information might well be brief. Ideas were expressed and conveyed which I could never have understood amid terrestrial circumstances, and things that were inconceivable in terms of the five senses, or in abstract symbols of philosophic or mathematic thought, were made plain to me as the letters of the alphabet. Certain of these data, however, are roughly conveyable or suggestible in language. I was told of the gradual process of initiation into the life of the new dimension, of the powers gained by the neophyte during his term of adaptation, of the various recondite aesthetic joys experienced through a mingling and multiplying of all the perceptions, of the control acquired over natural forces and over matter itself, so that raiment could be woven and buildings reared solely through an act of volition. I learned also of the laws that would control our passage to the further cosmos, and the fact that such passage was difficult and dangerous for anyone who had not lived a certain length of time in the inner dimension. Likewise, I was told that no one could return to our present plane from the higher cosmos, even as no one could go backward through the flame into Edmos. Angarth and Ebonley had dwelt long enough in the inner dimension, they said, to be eligible for entrance to the worlds beyond, and they thought that I too could escape through their assistance, even though I had not yet developed the faculty of spatial equilibrium necessary to sustain those who dared the interspheric path and its dreadful subjacent gulfs alone. There were boundless, unforeseeable realms, planet on planet, universe on universe to which we might attain, and among whose prodigies and marvels we could dwell or wander indefinitely. In these worlds, our brains would be attuned to the comprehension or apprehension of vaster and higher scientific laws, and states of entity beyond those of our present dimensional milieu. I have no idea of the duration of our flight, since, like everything else, my sense of time was completely altered and transfigured. Relatively speaking, we may have gone on for hours, but it seemed to me that we had crossed an area of that supernal terrain for whose transit many years or centuries might well have been required. Even before we came within sight of it, a clear pictorial image of our destination had arisen in my mind, doubtless through some sort of thought transference. I seemed to envision a stupendous mountain range, with Alp on celestial Alp, higher than the summer cumuli of earth, and above them all the horn of an ultraviolet peak whose head was enfolded in a hueless and spiral cloud, touched with the sense of invisible chromatic overtones that seemed to come down upon it from skies beyond the zenith. I knew that the way to the outer cosmos was hidden in the high cloud. On we soared, and at length the mountain range appeared on the far horizon, and I saw the paramount peak of ultraviolet with its dazzling crown of cumulus. Nearer still we came, till the strange volutes of cloud were almost above us, towering to the heavens and vanishing among the vari-colored suns. We saw the gleaming forms of pilgrims who preceded us as they entered the swirling folds. At this moment, the sky and landscape had flamed again to their culminating brilliance. They burned with 1,000 hues and lustres, so that the sudden, unlooked-for eclipse which now occurred was all the more complete and terrible. Before I was conscious of anything amiss, I seemed to hear a despairing cry from my friends, who must have felt the oncoming calamity through a subtler sense than any of which I was yet capable. Then, beyond the high and luminescent Alp of our destination, I saw the mounting of a wall of darkness, dreadful and instant and positive and palpable, that rose everywhere, and toppled like some Atlantean wave upon the irised suns and the fiery-colored vistas of the inner dimension. We hung irresolute in the shadowed air, powerless and hopeless before the impending catastrophe, and saw that the darkness had surrounded the entire world and was rushing upon us from all sides. It ate the heavens, it blotted the outer suns, and the vast perspectives over which we had flown appeared to shrink and shrivel like a blackened paper. We seemed to wait alone for one terrible instant, in a center of dwindling light on which the cyclonic forces of night and destruction were impinging with torrential rapidity. The center shrank to a mere point, and then the darkness was upon us like an overwhelming maelstrom, like the falling and crashing of cyclopean walls. I seemed to go down with the wreck of shattered worlds in a roaring sea of vortical space and force, to descend into some infrastellar pit, some ultimate limbo to which the shards of forgotten suns and systems are flung. Then, after a measureless interval, there came the sensation of violent impact, as if I had fallen among these shards at the bottom of the universal night. I struggled back to consciousness with slow, prodigious effort, as if I were crushed beneath some irremovable weight, beneath the lightness and inert debris of galaxies. It seemed to require the labors of a titan to lift my lids, and my body and limbs were heavy as if they had been turned to some denser element than human flesh, or had been subjected to the gravitation of a grosser planet than the Earth. My mental processes were benumbed and painful and confused to the last degree. But at length I realized that I was lying on a riven and tilted pavement, among gigantic blocks of fallen stone. Above me, the light of a livid heaven came down among overturned and jagged walls that no longer supported their colossal dome. Close beside me, I saw a fuming pit from which a ragged rift extended through the floor, like the chasm wrought by an earthquake. I could not recognize my surroundings for a time, but at last, with a toilsome groping of thought, I understood that I was lying in the ruined temple of Idmos. The pit whose gray and acrid vapors rose beside me was that from which the fountain of the singing flame had issued. It was a scene of stupendous havoc and devastation. The wrath that had been visited upon Idmos had left no wall nor pylon of the temple standing. I stared at the blighted heavens from an architectural ruin in which the remains of On and Angkor would have been mere rubble heaps. With Herculean effort, I turned my head away from the smoking pit, whose thin, sluggish fumes curled upward in phantasmal coils where the green ardor of the flame had soared and sung. Not until then did I perceive my companions. Angarth, still insensible, was lying near at hand, and just beyond him I saw the pale, contorted face of Ebonley, whose lower limbs and body were pinned down by the rough and broken pediment of a fallen pillar. Striving as in some eternal nightmare to throw off the leaden, clinging weight of my inertia, and able to bestir myself only with the most painful slowness and laboriousness, I got somehow to my feet and went over to Ebonley. Angarth, I saw at a glance, was uninjured, and would presently regain consciousness. But Ebonley, crushed by the monolithic mass of stone, was dying swiftly. And even with the help of a dozen men, I could not have released him from his imprisonment, nor could I have done anything to palliate his agony. He tried to smile with gallant and piteous courage as I stooped above him. "It's no use. I'm going in a moment," he whispered. "Goodbye, Hastane. And tell Angarth goodbye for me too." His tortured lips relaxed, his eyelids dropped, and his head fell back on the temple pavement. With an unreal, dreamlike horror, almost without emotion, I saw that he was dead. The exhaustion that still beset me was too profound to permit of thought or feeling. It was like the first reaction that follows the awakening from a drug debauch. My nerves were like burnt-out wires, my muscles dead and unresponsive as clay. My brain was ashen and gutted, as if a great fire had burned within it and gone out. Somehow, after an interval of whose length my memory is uncertain, I managed to revive Angarth, and he sat up dully and dazedly. When I told him that Ebonley was dead, my words appeared to make no impression upon him, and I wondered for a while if he had understood. Finally, rousing himself a little with evident labor and difficulty, he peered at the body of our friend, and seemed to realize in some measure the horror of the situation. But I think he would have remained there for hours, or perhaps for all time, in his utter despair and lassitude, if I had not taken the initiative. "Come," I said, with an attempt at firmness. "We must get out of this." "Where to?" he queried, dully. "The flame has failed at its source, and the inner dimension is no more. I wish I were dead like Ebonley. I might as well be, judging from the way I feel." "We must find our way back to Crater Ridge," I said. "Surely we can do it if the interdimensional portals have not been destroyed." Angarth did not seem to hear me, but he followed obediently when I took him by the arm and began to seek an exit from the temple's heart, among the roofless halls and overturned columns. My recollections of our return are dim and confused, and are full of the tediousness of some interminable delirium. I remember looking back at Ebonley, lying white and still beneath the massive pillar that would serve as an eternal monument for him. And I recall the mountainous ruins of the city, in which it seemed that we were the only living beings, a wilderness of chaotic stone, of fused obsidian-like blocks, where streams of molten lava still ran in the mighty chasms, or poured like torrents adown unfathomable pits that had opened in the ground. And I remember seeing amid the wreckage the charred bodies of those dark colossi who were the people of Idmos and the warders of the flame. Like pygmies lost in some shattered fortalice of the giants, we stumbled onward, strangling in mephitic and metallic vapors, reeling with weariness, dizzy with the heat that emanated everywhere to surge upon us in buffeting waves. The way was blocked by overthrown buildings, by toppled towers and battlements over which we climbed precariously and toilsomely. And often we were compelled to divagate from our direct course by enormous rifts that seemed to cleave the foundations of the world. The moving towers of the wrathful outer lords had withdrawn. Their armies had disappeared on the plain beyond Idmos, when we staggered over the riven and shapeless and scoriac crags that had formed the city's ramparts. Before us there was nothing but desolation, a fire-blackened and vapor-vaulted expanse in which no tree or blade of grass remained. Across this waste we found our way to the slope of violet grass above the plain, which had lain beyond the path of the invaders' bolts. There, the guiding monoliths, reared by a people of whom we were never to learn even the name, still looked down upon the fuming desert and the mounded rack of Idmos. And there, at length, we came once more to the grayish-green columns that were the gateway between the worlds.